Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to give a technical review over a paper that I've given at URTEC a few years ago. This is determining the optimal artificial lift strategy in the Midland Basin, and this is combining numerical simulation with vertical flow performance tables. Before we get to the content, please be sure to like this video, subscribe so you can get more content in oil and gas and professional development topics, and please be sure to comment below so I can incorporate your feedback into future videos. Make sure you hit the notification bell when you hit that subscribe button because I upload every Friday and every Sunday. Every Friday is a professional development topic, and every Sunday is a technical review, such as this one. Well, let's continue with the content. Hey everyone, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about determining the optimal artificial lift strategy in the Midland Basin. This is some of the work I did with Texas Oil and Gas Institute and university lands, and this was presented at URTEC a few years ago. As an overview of the study, I'll give the objective, the workflow, the distributions of downtimes with the data from 2017, field case studies, economics and recommendations, and conclusions for the study. The objective of the study was to evaluate various artificial lift strategies based on production data and general operations. I wanted to develop a workflow to optimize artificial lift strategy by integrating reservoir modeling with vertical flowing pressure modeling. Candidate wells were located in the Wolfcamp D in the southern Midland Basin and the lower Sprayberry in the northern Midland Basin. Some of the takeaways from this presentation is that the ESP had the highest downtime and gas lift had the lowest downtime, and that includes the compressor downtime. And the workflow can help operators improve economics for the Wolfcamp D by recommending a gas lift installation at the beginning of the production and then switching to a rod pump or any positive displacement pump. The workflow can help operators improve NPV by recommending a combination of ESP to rod pump conversion for the lower Sprayberry shale. And we looked at GOR ranges that were above 2,000 scuffs per barrel versus lower Sprayberry wells or benches that have less than 2,000 scuffs per barrels. Here's the well one where they were located on university lands. This is located in an area called Area 4, if you remember from my previous YouTube video on underperforming wells for university lands. Located in Upton County, the reservoir pressure is around 5,900 psi, considered a high GOR and pretty high GLR well, and it was natural flow for at least a year before it was converted to gas lift. Well number 2 is lower Sprayberry, located in Andrews County. Reservoir pressure is a little bit lower because it is in a shallower target. It has a low GOR and low GLR, and it has a high rate. Our initial artificial lift strategy is that it had high rate and low rate ESP, so larger and smaller pumps. For new wells, we looked at artificial lift strategy workflows, such as looking at the data, then building well performance models by calibrating a numerical simulation model, build an analytical model based on RTA, or you could look at your type curve. You can forecast the PI with respect to time using these models, and we built wellbore models with different artificial lift strategies. We forecasted rates and flowing bottom hole pressures for different artificial lift. So this is an example of the flowing bottom hole pressure and the PI integration. PIs are the curves that are shown here with respect to different days. In an unconventional well, the PIs are going to be a little bit different for each time step because it's an unconventional reservoir and it's in a transient flow. But the intersection that you find at which you have different outflow curves are the optimal BHPs, or the minimum BHPs that you should be targeting for. So we wanted to assess the downtime, the cost, and operation limits for different artificial lift strategies. We determined scenarios for a single artificial lift or combined artificial lifts for a well's lifetime, performed economic analysis for all scenarios, and recommended the optimal artificial lift strategy. Here are the downtime distributions that I talked about before, and it's also mentioned in the paper as well. In the downtime distributions, you'll notice that ESP is represented in the blue, gas lift is represented in the red, and rod pump is represented in the green. Gas lift has the most narrow range of downtime distributions, and ESPs have the largest range of downtime distributions. and you're looking at the mean of about 17% for ESPs, 8% for gas lift, and 10% for rod pump. Artificial lift scenarios that we looked at were natural flow, or where you were flowing from the natural flow, and you have different well rates. You have different liquid rates for each of these types of ESPs. So a large ESP, for instance, would have a pump size that's rated to 3,800 or 4,000. A middle rate ESP is about 1,500 or 1,750, and a low rate ESP is around 800 or less than 1,000. Gas lift, you had liquid rates that you're lifting at about 3,500, or these are the different scenarios that we looked at for your gas lift. So you have ESP to gas lift conversion, ESP to a smaller ESP conversion, ESP to gas lift, and eventually you have your rod lift conversion. For this rod lift conversion, we looked at a maximum liquid rate of about 400 barrels of liquid per day. The bottom chart represents different bottom hole pressures that we were targeting, minimum flowing bottom hole pressures to convert from one artificial lift to another. So all the ESPs had about 600 psi, gas lift was around 500 psi, and rod pump is around 300 psi. And we implemented these average downtimes that we found in the Midland Basin. For the well 1, or that Wolfcamp D well, the asterisk represents what the operator ended up using for that particular artificial lift strategy. Here are the pressure profiles for the optimal artificial lift strategy that we were looking at. So we're looking at liquid rate, which is in the blue, your bottom hole pressure, which is in the orange, and you have your reservoir pressure, which is in the gray. You'll notice that reservoir pressure doesn't necessarily change much throughout time. But this is a strategy that we found as the optimal artificial lift strategy, where you have natural flow to gas lift to rod pump, and you convert to a gas lift as quickly as possible. So you switch to gas lift on day 4, and you switch to rod pump on day 234, or within a year. The biggest takeaway from these curves, these are cum curves with respect to each artificial lift strategy. And we found that the case with the lower minimum flowing bottom hole pressure gives the higher cumulative oil production. And we just wanted to show you different strategies and different minimum flowing bottom hole pressures here. If we had natural flow to a high rate ESP, the lowest cumulative production comes from case 2, because you go above the well's operating range and you end up converting to a rod pump much earlier on. Well 2's artificial lift scenarios is case 8, which it had a high rate and a mid rate ESP, and eventually it was converted to a rod pump. If you look at that bottom row right here. Here's the lower Sprayberry's liquid rate, flowing bottom hole pressure, and reservoir pressure. You'll notice that the reservoir pressure doesn't decline as much. We switched to a high rate ESP on day 2, and we switched to a low rate ESP within a year, or within 9 months. And you switch to a rod pump on day 870, or so within 3 years. We also looked at high rate ESP to gas lift to rod pump here. But in this case, because the high rate ESP, you reach a minimum flowing bottom hole pressure pretty quickly to 300 psi, you just go ahead and switch to a rod pump directly, so needing a gas lift is not necessary. At 500 ms, actually the gas lift wasn't efficient. So lower Sprayberry, we found these cum curves, and found for the particular AL strategy, which is AL4, we found, which is in yellow, shown over here, we had the highest cumulative production. Looking at the economics, these are the P50 economics that we found after contacting many operators in the Midland Basin when working for university lands, and these are rental costs instead of purchasing costs. For ESP, they are rental costs. So these are your ranges of OPEX, your ranges of workovers for each, and this was the oil price we ended up using. So this is a relatively conservative oil price at the time of this recording, but I would say that you could still use these economics and you can still use this workflow for any economic structure. For the Wolfcamp D, NPV is represented in orange and EUR is represented in blue. For the EURs, we ended up getting relatively low EUR with a relatively low NPV. And we ended up finding the gas lift had the highest NPV, even though it didn't necessarily have the highest EUR. So that's the strategy that we would end up recommending. For the Lower Sprayberry, you'd notice that the highest NPV came from case number 4, shown over here, with an NPV of 12.7 and an EUR of 930. So that's the case that we'd recommend. We also looked at gas lift sensitivity for our Lower Sprayberry well. What is the gas lift injection rate that is needed in order to reach the same minimum flow and bottom hole pressures and to get an optimal economics, because gas lift costs are much cheaper compared to the ESP. The highest EUR and NPV you had was an injection rate of 2,000 MCF per day, and the current operators' gas injection rates are not enough. So we would still recommend the ESP case, because you would need to have a really, really high injection rate that's above the average injection rate for your typical gas lift in the Midland Basin. Some of the conclusions that we came up with is that this workflow can be used to optimize AL strategy for the Midland Basin by using holistic well performance. For the Wolfcamp D, we recommend a gas lift to rod pump conversion. And for the Lower Sprayberry, we recommend a high rate ESP, and then within 9 months convert to a smaller rate ESP, and then eventually a rod pump. We integrate calibrated numerical models with the vertical flow performance models enabled forecasting long-term well performance and selecting the optimal artificial lift. Optimal gas injection and port size sensitivity analysis should also be taken into consideration. Again, you would need a larger port size compared to your average gas lift for those larger rates. That's the end of the presentation. Once again, thank you so much for watching this presentation. As usual, please be sure to like this video, subscribe so you can get more content in oil and gas and professional development topics, and please be sure to comment on the video so I can incorporate your feedback into future videos. Thank you once again, and I'll see you in the next one.